Differential reinforcement is defined as the reinforcement of some behaviors, but not others. In other words, reinforcement is provided contingent on occurrences of desired behaviors or the absence of problem behaviors, and minimized or withheld contingent on occurrences of problem behaviors. It is important to ensure the type of reinforcement delivered through differential reinforcement procedures is the same as the type of reinforcement the student accesses through engaging in problem behaviors. For example, if a student is engaging in a problem behavior to access adult attention, reinforcement provided through a differential reinforcement procedure should involve access to adult attention. One benefit of implementing extinction and differential reinforcement procedures together is a decreased probability educators encounter an extinction burst, or a temporary increase in the frequency, duration, and/or intensity of problem behavior upon implementing an extinction procedure. Extinction procedures involve educators discontinuing access to reinforcement contingent on occurrences of problem behaviors, but do not provide students with alternative strategies for accessing the reinforcement that previously maintained occurrences of these problem behaviors. Differential reinforcement procedures, on the other hand, provide students with socially acceptable strategies for accessing the reinforcement they previously accessed through engaging in problem behaviors, thereby rendering it less likely students will resort to engaging in these problem behaviors again. In other words, providing students with frequent access to reinforcement using differential reinforcement procedures can render engaging in problem behaviors irrelevant, as students are already accessing reinforcement consistently, and inefficient as the socially acceptable strategies for accessing reinforcement available through differential reinforcement procedures are more efficient strategies for accessing reinforcement compared to engaging in problem behaviors. Let's now discuss two differential reinforcement procedures commonly used when addressing behaviors disruptive to student learning within classroom settings. The first differential reinforcement procedure is differential reinforcement of diminishing rates, or DRD. Think of a DRD procedure as a starting point for those behaviors that are very frequent, where it would be unrealistic to say, okay, as long as you're not engaging in the problem behavior, you'll access reinforcement. If it's a problem behavior that the student engages in fairly frequently, they probably won't access reinforcement consistently if they need to refrain from engaging in the problem behavior altogether, thereby rendering it likely the student will instead engage in problem behaviors to access the reinforcement they are seeking. With DRD procedures, we provide reinforcement contingent on a problem behavior occurring at or below a predetermined criterion. This criterion gradually decreases as students engage in decreased occurrences of the problem behavior warranting the DRD procedure. Here's an example of a DRD procedure within a classroom setting. Imagine a student, Kristen, who was calling out about every 2 minutes during a 45-minute class, or approximately 22 times per class period. Again, think of a DRD procedure as providing us with a realistic first step towards addressing high-frequency behaviors such as this one. Through a DRD procedure, Kristen was provided with reinforcement contingent on calling out behaviors happening 20 times or fewer during the 45-minute class. Once Kristen consistently accessed reinforcement through calling out 20 times or fewer during the class, the criterion was adjusted for reinforcement to 18 callouts or fewer during the 45-minute class. Over time, Kristen's calling out behavior was decreased to a level that was neither disruptive to instruction nor socially stigmatizing to Kristen. Prior to implementing the DRD procedure, Kristen's peers often complained about her calling out behavior and were reluctant to work with Kristen during cooperative learning activities. To summarize, DRD procedures such as the one implemented with Kristen can support educators with gradually decreasing rates of problem behaviors through providing students with access to reinforcement contingent on gradual but significant behavior change. The second differential reinforcement procedure we'll discuss is differential reinforcement of higher rates, or DRH. Unlike DRD procedures, which are implemented with the goal of gradually decreasing occurrences of undesired behaviors over time, the goal of DRH procedures is to gradually increase desired behaviors over time. With DRH procedures, we provide reinforcement contingent on a desired behavior occurring at or above a predetermined criterion. This criterion gradually increases as students engage in increased occurrences of the desired behavior targeted through the DRH procedure. So here's an example of a DRH procedure within a classroom setting. Harold rarely completed expected tasks as part of morning activities in his classroom. Instead of completing morning activity tasks along with his peers, Harold would either sit and watch his peers complete expected tasks, or walk around his classroom until he found a preferred activity, such as a computer game or a toy train, to engage in. The DRH procedure involved providing Harold access to these preferred activities contingent on task completion. Specifically, since Harold would often complete 0 or 1 expected tasks during morning activities, Harold was initially provided access to reinforcement contingent on Harold completing 2 expected tasks during morning activities. Now, it's important to keep in mind that 2 expected tasks during morning activities was only the starting point. As Harold began consistently completing 2 tasks during morning activities after implementation of the DRH procedure, the criterion Harold needed to achieve to access reinforcement was gradually increased. Within a few short weeks of implementing a DRH procedure, Harold was routinely completing the same 5 expected tasks as his peers during morning activities. Differential reinforcement of other behavior, or DRO for short, and also referred to as differential reinforcement of 0 rates and omission training, is a type of differential reinforcement that involves providing students with reinforcement contingent on the problem behavior not occurring during a predetermined time interval or at a predetermined time. Providing students with frequent access to reinforcement using DRO procedures can render it both unnecessary for students to engage in problem behaviors, as students are already accessing reinforcement consistently, and inefficient, as refraining from engaging in problem behaviors often takes less effort than engaging in problem behaviors. Let's look at an example of a practical application for DRO procedures. Before implementing a DRO procedure, Wendy rarely followed her 2nd grade classroom schedule. Instead, Wendy would wander around the classroom, engaging in preferred tasks and activities. Specifically, tangibles Wendy frequently accessed include books, dolls, center items in her classroom, and items off of her teacher's desk, such as figurines and stuffed animals. When these tangibles were taken away from Wendy, Wendy would engage in physically aggressive behaviors towards adults, primarily her classroom teacher, such as biting, scratching, hitting with a closed fist, kicking, and spitting. A functional behavior assessment determined that Wendy engaged in the physically aggressive behaviors to access tangibles. Before implementing a DRO procedure, when Wendy engaged in physical aggression, the teacher working with Wendy would immediately notify both the school behavior specialist and the principal. After arriving in Wendy's classroom, the school behavior specialist and principal would interlock arms with Wendy and walk her to the principal's office. In other words, they would implement a restraint procedure. If Wendy continued to engage in physical aggression in the principal's office, Wendy's parents were typically notified, and Wendy was sent home for the remainder of the school day. Due to Wendy's behavior, Wendy's IEP team was considering more restrictive placements to keep Wendy and her peers safe, as well as facilitate Wendy's academic achievement and progress towards her IEP goals. A fixed interval differential reinforcement of other behavior, or FIDRO procedure, was implemented with Wendy to address these escalated problem behaviors. Fixed interval differential reinforcement of other behavior, a type of differential reinforcement, involves 3 main components. Educators establish time intervals for data collection purposes, provide reinforcement contingent on the absence of the problem behavior during a time interval, and withhold reinforcement contingent on the occurrence of the problem behavior during a time interval. If problem behaviors do occur during a time interval, the time interval is discontinued and a new time interval begins. To increase the probability that students frequently access reinforcement through fixed interval differential reinforcement of other behavior procedures, time intervals should align with baseline data collection related to the target behavior. For example, for a student who engages in physical aggression approximately every 20 minutes, time intervals included in a fixed interval differential reinforcement of other behavior procedure may begin at approximately every 15 minutes. Then, as occurrences of physical aggression decrease, the length of the intervals can be gradually increased. Before implementation of a fixed interval differential reinforcement of other behavior procedure with Wendy, she engaged in physical aggression towards adults approximately every 15 minutes throughout the school day. To decrease occurrences of physical aggression, Wendy would be provided with access to tangibles at least every 15 minutes throughout the school day. Otherwise, Wendy would resort to engaging in physical aggression towards adults to access tangibles as she had done in the past. To safeguard against this scenario, Wendy's IEP team decided to implement fixed interval differential reinforcement of other behavior procedures beginning with 10-minute time intervals. In other words, at the conclusion of a 10-minute interval during which 0 occurrences of physical aggression occur, Wendy had the opportunity to select from a wide array of preferred items and activities, including books, dolls, figurines, stuffed animals, and play with one of these tangibles for 3 minutes. When Wendy engaged in physical aggression towards one or more adults during a time interval, the time interval was discontinued, and after Wendy had stopped engaging in physically aggressive behaviors, a new time interval began. Now you might be thinking, couldn't Wendy just wander around the classroom accessing books, dolls, center items in her classroom, and items off of her teacher's desk, such as figurines and stuffed animals, as she had done in the past, regardless of whether or not she engaged in physical aggression? In order to withhold access to reinforcement until Wendy met the stipulations of the fixed interval differential reinforcement of other behavior procedure, Wendy's teacher removed the figurines and stuffed animals from her desk and locked them in a cabinet in her classroom. A fixed interval differential reinforcement of other behavior procedure is one of several DRO procedures for decreasing occurrences of challenging behavior available to educators. This visual provides a brief overview of common DRO procedures as well as practical examples involving the application of these procedures when addressing challenging student behaviors within school settings. Let's talk about advantages and disadvantages of DRO procedures. One advantage of DRO procedures is that since the students don't need to learn and demonstrate a new socially acceptable behavior to access reinforcement, students can typically access reinforcement consistently through these procedures. This reduces the probability students will resort to engaging in problem behaviors to access reinforcement within school settings. One limitation of DRO procedures is that rather than providing reinforcement contingent on a desired behavior occurring, we are merely reinforcing the absence of the problem behavior within a time interval or at a specific time. Consequently, we're not teaching and reinforcing socially acceptable behaviors students can use to access reinforcement in a variety of contexts and situations, both within the school setting and beyond. Fortunately, DRO procedures can and should be combined with other behavioral interventions to facilitate student success within school settings. For example, DRO procedures can be combined with class-wide strategies for promoting student success that involve enriching learning environments through frequent access to reinforcement, as well as promoting student engagement through frequent opportunities for active participation. They can also be combined with customized interventions that involve teaching and reinforcing socially acceptable forms of communication likely to result in reinforcement within the school setting, such as differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, or DRA for short, procedures. Differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, or DRA for short, is a type of differential reinforcement that involves teaching and reinforcing socially acceptable alternatives to problem behaviors. Educators can use DRA interventions to teach students alternative strategies for accessing wants and needs within school settings, reinforce students for utilizing these alternative strategies within school settings, and minimize or altogether withhold reinforcement contingent on occurrences of problem behaviors. There are 3 fundamental components of DRA interventions. First, engaging in alternative behaviors, taught and reinforced as part of DRA interventions, must allow students to consistently and immediately access or avoid the same stimuli as engaging in the problem behavior. For example, if a student has accessed peer and adult attention for hitting peers in the past, engaging in an alternative behavior such as verbalizing a conversation starter on the playground must be immediately reinforced with peer and adult attention. If students do not consistently and immediately access or avoid the same stimuli that has maintained occurrences of problem behaviors in the past, they are likely to resort back to engaging in these problem behaviors to access reinforcement within school settings. Second, the alternative behavior taught and reinforced as part of a DRA intervention should be a step towards the long-term behavior goal for a particular student. For example, let's say educators decide to implement a DRA intervention with a student who runs out of their classroom without permission in order to temporarily avoid or altogether escape a non-preferred task or activity. Educators may decide to teach the student to signal for requesting a break, or verbally request a break during classroom activities, as well as immediately provide the student with a brief activity break contingent on the student demonstrating this new behavior. While taking a brief activity break in the middle of an activity may not be ideal, Reinforcing this behavior may be a small step towards the long-term goal of increased class participation for the student. Third, the alternative behavior must be perceived as socially acceptable among a student's educators and family members. If the alternative behavior is not perceived as socially acceptable, educators and family members are less likely to consistently reinforce occurrences of the alternative behavior. For example, let's say a student frequently logs onto a computer without educator permission in school or family member permission at home. A replacement behavior that involves verbally requesting computer access may not be perceived as socially acceptable, since in both the home and school settings, there are times when computer access may be restricted, and verbal requests to access the computer cannot be consistently reinforced. In this case, a different alternative behavior may need to be identified, or perhaps we clearly communicate verbal requests to access technology will only be reinforced with computer access during specific times of the day at home and in school. DRA interventions have been used to address escalated student behaviors, such as physical aggression, property destruction, and leaving assigned areas without permission, and can be thought of as win-win scenarios for educators and students. By engaging in socially acceptable behaviors, students are able to access the same type of reinforcement they previously accessed by engaging in the problem behaviors. By consistently and immediately reinforcing occurrences of alternative behaviors taught as part of DRA interventions and minimizing or withholding reinforcement contingent on problem behaviors, educators are able to both incentivize socially acceptable behaviors and maintain instructional control in their classrooms. Let's look at an example involving Marcus, who, based on a recent functional behavior assessment, engaged in escalated behaviors to temporarily avoid or altogether escape school activities. For example, when Marcus was asked to engage in math activities in his classroom, Marcus would throw computers and keyboards on the floor, flip over chairs and tables, rip down classroom bulletin boards, and engage in other forms of property destruction. When Marcus engaged in these escalated behaviors, the classroom teacher would immediately notify school administrators. Upon entering Marcus's classroom, the school administrators would verbally prompt Marcus to stop engaging in property destruction. If Marcus did not comply, which was typically the case, school administrators would often implement a restraint procedure by interlocking arms with Marcus and escorting him to the principal's office. If Marcus continued to engage in property destruction in the principal's office, Marcus's parents were typically notified. Upon arriving at school, Marcus's parents would take Marcus home for the remainder of the school day. To support Marcus with improving his grades and making progress towards his IEP goals, a long-term goal for Marcus was for him to consistently and independently complete math activities. Now, this wasn't going to happen overnight. There was no feasible intervention that would result in Marcus ceasing all occurrences of property destruction while simultaneously completing independent math activities at the same rate as his peers. With this in mind, Marcus's IEP team decided to develop and implement a DRA procedure with the goals of decreasing property destruction and increasing task completion during math activities. Here's a visual outlining the process used by Marcus's team to decrease occurrences of property destruction and increase replacement behaviors that served as stepping stones to the long-term behavior goal of Marcus independently completing math activities at the same rate as his peers. Based on data collection prior to the implementation of the DRA procedure, it was noted that Marcus typically engaged in property destruction 2 to 3 times per math class. In order to render engaging in property destruction irrelevant, Marcus was provided the opportunity to present 3 break cards in class in order to take brief activity breaks. As occurrences of property destruction decreased, Marcus's educators gradually faded the provision of brief breaks, the alternative behavior taught and reinforced as part of DRA procedure from independent seat work. Marcus was eventually transitioned from 3 break cards per class to 2 break cards per class, and as occurrences of property destruction continued to decrease, he was transitioned to only 1 break card per class. Eventually, Marcus was not issued break cards altogether, and instead he was provided the opportunity to request teacher or peer support with 1 problem on an independent seat work math activity each class period. It's important to keep in mind that except in cases when the alternative and desired behaviors are one and the same, like raising one's hand to access adult attention, for example, educators and family members are only temporarily reinforcing occurrences of alternative behaviors. For example, After Marcus began to engage in property destruction less frequently and utilizes break cards more frequently in order to temporarily avoid math activities, Marcus's educators gradually began teaching and reinforcing behaviors that more closely resembled Marcus's long-term behavioral goal of independently completing math activities at the same rate as his peers. Unlike the lengthy periods of independent seat work Marcus had been avoiding or altogether escaping by engaging in property destruction behaviors, engaging in the replacement behaviors resulted in Marcus accessing shorter activity breaks during math lessons. In other words, providing Marcus with opportunities to utilize break cards or request teacher or peer support with one problem on an independent seat work math activity increased the amount of independent math seat work Marcus completed on a daily basis. As Marcus more consistently accessed the same type of naturally occurring reinforcement that maintained the task completion of his peers, improved grades and skill mastery for example, the need for break cards was reduced gradually as natural forms of reinforcement maintained and increased rates of task completion during math class.